Welcome back to the shit show. Today we're talking about Rings of Power. That would be a good podcast name, but I'm sure that's been taken since before Joe Rogan started his. Yesterday we watched the first episode of The Rings of Power, and we were planning on watching all of the ones that are currently available on Amazon, which I believe is the first 3 episodes. To be honest, the first one was enough to get through. So we decided to just split it each week. We'll just watch one episode and we will devote a section of the podcast to that. And that will be better for me editing as well if I only have to edit like 2 hours of us talking rather than 5.5 hours. We haven't really discussed the episode that we watched all that much, but we did take notes as we were going through it. So I have my list of notes, he has his list of notes, and we're just basically going to be going through, talking about the first episode. For context, I've not read The Silmarillion. Looseway's not all the way through. I've started it a few times and then just never finished it. He has read The Silmarillion, and I was planning on reading it before The Rings of Power came out, but then there was an interview with the directors, I believe, where they said that, oh, this isn't actually based on The Silmarillion because we don't have the rights to that, which I think everyone thought that they did, or at least I was under the impression. So I didn't read it because I didn't know what to expect from this show, because they said that this show takes place during the Second Age, I believe, which there isn't as much history on the Second Age as there is, obviously, in the First Age when the Silmarillion happens, I think, or before the First Age and the First Age, and then in the Third Age where Lord of the Rings takes place.
The history is chronicled pretty well. It's not like he doesn't leave much room for things. But yeah, I think the Second Age is probably it would definitely be the place if you're going to create a new story, or you could go beyond the Third Age.
Yeah, which honestly probably would have been a better idea for the show, maybe, is have, like, not that we needed a Lord of the Rings or any type of Tolkien show. I wouldn't call the show a Tolkien show. It just has the Lord of the Rings name slapped onto it. Just a generic fantasy show. I think a lot of people don't know how Tolkien created Middle-earth and the Lord of the Rings subsequently. He was a linguist. He was a professor of linguistics, specifically in Old English, I believe. That might not be the correct title, but that's kind of the gist of what he was knowledgeable in. And he had been creating languages since he was 13 or 14 years old, because he said that there's just something about languages that just fascinated him and that he enjoyed. So he started creating these languages, and he created the language of Elvish. It might not have been called that at the time, but he created their language. He created the Dwarven language. He created the language of Rohan. He created all these different languages and then said, I need to have a people to speak these languages. So he created the elves and the dwarves and the men of Rohan and the men of Gondor. And then he said, well, now I've got these people with a language. And it's an incredibly functional language. It's very in-depth what he did. It's not like, when you were passing notes in school and you just replaced English characters with your own made-up characters, but it still followed the same English rules and the English grammar, just with different characters. These languages have their own syntax, their own grammatical rules, and the Dwarven language is based on Semitic languages, so it's read right to left instead of left to right. Tolkien was very detailed in how he created these, and he made a people to go with the languages and then had to make a history to go with the people, because you can't just have people who speak a language. You need to give them depth and background. So he did that. He made the most detailed fantasy that we have, and it likely will not be replicated, at least not to this extent, and definitely not in our lifetime.
Onto that, this is the area in which I find the most interest, is that his world on top of the histories that he created, because obviously he was a philologist, which means that he was interested in the area of knowledge concerning the history of languages and how they've evolved and related to each other, as well as cultures. So, yes, he did develop the language, initially, and then created a history, and, he drew from a lot of different elements to make this, world that he had. But most importantly is the world building element that, like you said, has never been seen before and probably never will be seen again. Almost universally, it is the case that fantasy authors draw from Tolkien or from someone who drew from Tolkien before them.
I would think it would be almost impossible now to create a fantasy world without having even like the slightest bit of Tolkien influence, because there was something just so complete about what he did.
Yeah, I think he was truly one of one. Was that the kind of idea that people communicate that with? Is he was... You're never going to find another person who's that dedicated to something like a work of fiction, because people don't realize this. The amount of work and effort he put into this is incredible. I mean, it's one thing to make your own language. I think that's difficult enough. But, he's an expert in that area. So if anyone could do it, he could do it. But he didn't stop there. He not only created that, he created his own creation epic. Right? He created his own history, and a detailed one, written much like a historical document would be written if you had somebody, chronicling these things, much like the histories we read of Rome and of Greece. And obviously he drew from these elements to create these works. So, as was said before, I've read the Silmarillion. And one of my favorite things about it is at the beginning, he tells a creation epic, much like the Epic of Gilgamesh or, the biblical account in Genesis. There's this metaphorical use of song to create the world. And he uses the idea of a song with, all the chords and the melody and harmonies and all these ideas. And it's sort of a metaphor for the creation of all things. And as far as his inspiration that he drew, clearly he had many inspirations. So you have elements from Nordic culture and their mythical beliefs. You have the pantheon of gods in Rome and Greece, obviously, that, have their part. That's the Ainur. But then you have the most fundamental, which was his religion that he had adopted himself, which was Roman Catholic Christianity. And specifically the philosophy of St. Augustine behind it, which is incredible. That he not only created a world, his own creation epic, but also built it up with the philosophy behind it to give it some depth, philosophical depth specifically. I read a lot of fantasy novels that don't have much philosophical depth outside of the fact that they've probably been influenced by Tolkien, but they'll take routes that don't match up with the metaphysical aspects they've set up behind the scenes. And I only say that, I don't want to get too deep into this, obviously, but it's important for a work of fiction like that goes that far back, to establish its philosophical roots very clearly. And I think Tolkien does an amazing job doing that. And that is the part of the story that I think is the most important in his works, and it's my favorite. And so for me, when I'm thinking of the show that we just watched, having read the Silmarillion and having read through, the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit, I'm very familiar with his works, but what's most important to me is I don't want to say, it's not theme, it's the philosophy behind what he wrote and what he's trying to communicate. What is the ultimate nature of reality in this world that he's created? What does it look like? And in which case, once you figure it out, how does that affect the way you read the narrative? And my suggestion is it affects it greatly. So people that defend it should learn the philosophy behind, the writings, if they want to understand the story. And, for example, the line that Gandalf says, which is featured in the movie, in the Fellowship of the Ring, when he tells Frodo that, there are greater powers in this world than... They're more than just the powers of evil that are at work. And all who live to see times of evil wish they weren't, involved in it. But it's not for them to decide. All they have to decide is what to do with the time that's given to them. All these concepts have their philosophical roots, in the same places. And so it is very important to understand that, because that narrative hinges on that philosophy. if that philosophy is false, then Gandalf's words become meaningless or pointless or make no sense. And so there's one example of why it's important to know it and why I'm so passionate about it.
So, going over the notes that I have, the way that we took these notes was just as we were watching the show. So, this should follow the episode fairly chronologically. But obviously, there will be some notes that will be a little bit more general. For example, my first note is the dialogue. It's so bad. Like, it sounds like you hired a 7-year-old. You gave him a thesaurus and said, write the script. And he did. And this is the best he could do. Like, they spent $1 billion on the show. Obviously, most of that went to CGI. You would think that people would learn from the mistakes of other productions. The Star Wars sequel trilogy, all of the budget was spent on CGI. And then obviously you have bigger name actors like Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford. There should be more care devoted to the writing. And then the producers and directors for the Rings of Power show decided to make the same mistake that the Star Wars writers and producers made, where most of the care is going to be spent on CGI and, oh, does it look pretty? Does it look good? Rather than the substance of the actual show, the writing, the dialogue, character development, all of that comes not even second. It feels like it just comes in last. Like, it's just an afterthought. Like, oh shit, we should probably have characters say something to this guy.
Well, I think one of the things that bothers me about a lot of these productions is that, like you said, there's these elements of the show that are obviously well done in a certain sense. Like, I don't want to say that every scene is just a disaster or every set that they filmed on is terrible or something like that. Like, some of the areas you're in feel like Lord of the Rings. It feels like the movies. There are,
I wouldn't say
specifically
that
there's
either.
the part where they're standing in I don't know, I don't remember where it was. They were having that meeting with the High King when Galadriel meets with Elrond, and they're by all the carved.
Oh, like in the woods, which was very pretty, and I did like it. But at the same time, where's the architecture? Are you tell me the elves didn't build houses or?
Well, it can be just a little away from where all the buildings are out in there, like an area that's kind of like, you can treat it like a garden memorial or something like that. I was fine with it. I'm not gonna nitpick that far. I would prefer to see elven architecture at its height in the Second Age. That would have been great. And there are elements of that. They show a preview of one of the cities in Valinor, and that is what I want to see. Right? I want to see Valinor. I want to see it like embodied, like actually shown. Because in the Silmarillion, it's a huge element, right? The elves are led there.
It's supposed to be like heaven, right?
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, essentially. It's a place where, I think in the show they refer to it as the winterless spring, is a line that comes up, and it's like, it is that concept, that heavenly concept where you sail to the shores of Valinor, and it's this land, and it is a physical land. As far as Tolkien's writings go, which is in the show, I want to talk about this element that they introduced a little later. And I don't necessarily have a problem with it, because I think they understand the concept that Valinor is this place where the Ainur exist, and the Valar specifically, that's what they are, title-wise.
And those are the gods or higher beings of this universe.
Yes, they are the deities. They are the pantheon of deities, but they are not the supreme deity. That is the element of Christianity that Tolkien kept in. Obviously, we know Eru, Iluvatar. I don't know how to pronounce it. If it's Uvatar or Iluvatar.
I think it's Iluvatar, but I
I
don't know.
think it is. Yeah, it's. I think it's in Elvish is the language. So
I don't speak Elvish.
yeah, well, anyways, there's a supreme being that created everything, and that did it with the help of the Ainur, who are also, I'm assuming, created beings. And Eru is sort of removed. He's that unmoved mover kind of idea and philosophy. Sort of an Aristotelian, like, he's outside of everything. He's just kind of distant. He's an idea almost in this universe. But you have the Ainur, who are these beings who have involved themselves in creation. Their titles are the Valar. They're essentially in charge of Arda, which is this plane of existence that has been created. And it's where Middle-earth resides. It's where Valinor resides. It's where all these other places reside. And it's sort of the place where they begin to discover the created things. Like Eru creates the elves and men, and the elves are first created, and they're discovered by the Ainur. Specifically, a couple of the Ainur discover them and attempt to gain their trust and show them Valinor. So they want them to see their home where they reside, because they reside in Arda now. And there's this great element in the stories where it's like, it's such a cool concept, and it's again what I get at is like the level of detail Tolkien put into this is amazing, and the things that he created from it it's such a cool. The world building is the best world building, I think, of any written fictional world. It's so detailed. It's hard to go wrong with it, and that's one of my issues with the show is they have so much material to draw from. So we start off the show, in my view, from a position that it should have been the strength of the show, right? They just kind of brush over Morgoth, who's one of the Ainur, who is the Satan figurehead in this case. He's the first of the Valar. So like Satan, he's the most essentially the most beautiful, powerful angel. So in Christian theology, he was the most beautiful and highest ranked angel, and essentially he became arrogant and wanted to take the place of God, who in this case would be Eru. And Morgoth, who was once Melkor, his name changes, and he becomes this character that we have. It's such a cool element of a story that Tolkien created this whole thing, and I wanted to really, really see that explored a little bit in film, in this visual medium that we have. We have the technology nowadays that we can pull it off, and it could look great. And so when I heard they had this budget, I was like, wow, this is going to be great. Like finally seeing these elements that I've always, that I've read about from the Silmarillion brought to life, and right off the bat, it's just a filler for the history of the world that we kind of already knew. Most people probably already knew it. I understand why you have it as a narrative if you're not going to start there. It's important for people to understand the background of these characters, but I mean, for one, that helps establish who Sauron is in the first place. He's not the big bad guy in the whole series. He's not the ultimate evil.
He's the second in command, but even still, there were a few who were also on his level.
Yeah, the Balrogs. Commander of the Balrogs is on the level of Sauron, maybe even more powerful.
And what about that, not Shelob, but the big-ass spider?
Ungoliant.
Yeah.
Well, Ungoliant's a thing.
Is that separate, or...?
So Ungoliant's her own thing. She is more powerful than even Morgoth, or as powerful, or close to as powerful. She was a danger to existence itself. She's sort of this chaotic element that's just introduced, and I think this is one of my favorite aspects of Tolkien's writing, is that he doesn't go into any detail about how she came to be, why she exists. She's just this thing that eats light. She's just this absence of light, this sort of chaotic element that even Morgoth is not a match for how powerful she is, right? She makes a deal with him and breaks it, or he breaks it. One of the two break the deal that they have, right? And so at the beginning of the show, that is an important element, the Silmarils and this tree of light. It's the whole story of the Silmarillion surrounds the Silmarils and the light from Valinor and these trees. And that's a whole thing. I don't want to get into it because, for one, you haven't read it, so I don't want to spoil it. But it's...
Even though the book's been out for longer than I've been alive.
Longer than both of us. But it's just a great narrative element to world building, is to add elements that even you don't know for sure. And that's how Tolkien seemed to approach it, where he was just like, oh, I don't know where she comes from. I remember reading about an interview he did where it was like, who is this character? And it was like, some things are just mysteries, and it's the same with Tom Bombadil. And it was like, you wrote it, man. But he treats it as like a history, like a world where there are elements that you don't understand how they came to be, and you wonder why would this exist? Shouldn't it be Morgoth who is this all powerful? But no, he's sort of tested. He's pushed to his limits, and the only people that save him are the Balrogs. They save him from Ungoliant, and it's such a brilliant element to the story. And then it's the character of Shelob later on, who's the child of Ungoliant, the light devourer, this person. And it's again, it's the philosophy and the history is so important, because when you see the fight that Sam and Frodo have with Shelob, it's this sort of, it's a microcosm of a greater battle that had taken place prior that was fought and lost in a different way. And so Galadriel, who is very, very pivotal in that story of the Silmarils, right? She's the Lady of Light. She has a star that she gives to Frodo. It's a very important element in the Silmarillion. There are artifacts that are very important that Tolkien records and tracks the history of, including the ring Aragorn is given, the Even Star, just all these different things. They're very symbolic, and it's beautiful, because that alone would make a story, which he did. You have elements that there are stories in the Silmarillion you could have told throughout, but it's so brilliant. The writing is the world building is I can't talk about it enough. It is so great.
One of my favorite interviews with Tolkien, it's on YouTube somewhere. I'm not sure as to the actual title of it, but he's speaking with this interviewer about how he started making languages and when he started doing it and why he likes it. And while they're talking, he's got like a little pad of paper and a pen in front of him, and he starts writing in Elvish. And, he's writing through the characters very slowly, and he's explaining to the interviewer what he's writing, what it says in Elvish and in English. And he says, well, obviously my handwriting isn't as beautiful as theirs. I'm like, bro, it's your handwriting. You wrote this. And even he messed it up while he was writing. He said, I think the exact quote is, "Oh God, I've messed it up, haven't I?" Like, it's your language. Like, the depth that he put into the world building, into this world that he created, I don't think could ever be properly explored on a visual medium, because how could you?
Well, I think it could, but you would need the amount of resources you would need, and it would have to be Disney levels of show production, and the quality.
You would need billions, or at least really, really good practical effects, which people don't really do anymore.
Right. What I'm saying, though, is like you could theoretically make a visual medium of the history of Middle Earth where you go over it and you make a show about each thing, like how they're doing with the Marvel series. Like, they've got this whole universe they've built. You could do that, but would it do it justice is the question.
I don't think so.
I doubt it. I doubt that you could do much justice to the degree of just detail is insane. And that's why I think this was one of the more ambitious IPs to attempt to make a show about. And I've seen this, and I want to preface our getting into the episode with this one last thing. I've seen people criticize those who've critiqued the show as being
phobes and ists and isms.
Yes. Yeah. It's this you hide behind all these insults that you can lob at people who don't like something that you may like, right? And fine, if there are people out there who like the Rings of Power, that's fine. Everyone can like their, the thing that they like, but you cannot shield yourself from legitimate critiques.
You have to acknowledge the thing you like is bad. There are a lot of really bad movies, awful movies that I love, but they're trash, and I know that.
Right. There are cult classics that are great movies, but a lot of people don't like them from the reverse. You know what I mean? Like, because they take chances, and a lot of people don't like that in film and movies, which is very apparent. But most people, I think, would like more movies and shows to do that, take a little more chances with some things. Now, depending on what kind of chances you take, that's the important part, is where you're taking your chances. So a lot of these shows nowadays take their chances in directions that I think are, I don't want to say self-serving. It's serving to a population that is minimal, but is loud and obnoxious and is taking over a lot of things. And I think watching them take over some of the most culturally important literary pieces of media that we have and old movies that are being reprised and remade, watching them take over these things and destroy them with their ideology is frustrating. And I think that's part of what I go into a lot of the way that I watch shows now. A lot of the ways that I view a show are going to be filtered through this lens now, where I see the show and I go, well, what are they going to do to it this time? How are they going to take the thing that I really enjoy and love, and a lot of people enjoy and love, and the thing about it that they enjoy and love is fundamental to that thing. How are they going to mess that up? People can call me any name under the sun. They can call me every single thing they want. But the fact of the matter is, you cannot deny that what made the thing important in most people's eyes is being ripped apart once you break it down and analyze it. Once you discover what it is that made the thing important, which my argument is it's the philosophy behind it, most people don't even realize it. But that element and the level of detail in the narrative combined just make it one of the greatest fantasy epics that's ever been created. Probably the greatest. I want to preface this with that's where I'm coming from. And that's where probably we are coming from, is we love Lord of the Rings.
Probably to a unhealthy degree, for me at least.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I have an unhealthy obsession or anything like with it. I reserve that for other things, but I would say it is a great love of mine. I do love the world building and the story and the philosophy behind it. It's certainly one of my favorites. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into the episode. Let's start with your notes and let's compare what we wrote down. I just want to see where we're at.
My first note is that the dialogue in this show is just atrociously bad. So bad. What I've seen in this show is, oh, this castle is here. This castle's been abandoned for centuries. No one's here now. We're not going with you. This is crazy. What you're doing is crazy. There are so many better ways you can communicate that. The castle having been abandoned for centuries, obviously, you don't have to say that. It looks like it. The doors are iced over. There are things frozen into the walls. No one has clearly been there in a really long time. You don't have to say, this place has been abandoned, if we can see that it has been abandoned. You don't have to say that the company doesn't want to be with Galadriel anymore. They look like they don't want to. They're falling behind. They're staying behind. They're unhappy. They're upset. You don't have to say, we're unhappy, we're upset, when you can show it on their faces. That was something that Peter Jackson did really well. In particularly The Fellowship, I think he kind of, not to say that he did it badly in the other two movies, but in The Fellowship specifically, there were I don't know the term for this, but there were a lot of really close up with Ian McKellen's face, with Gandalf's face, with Frodo's face, with Aragorn and Boromir's faces. Very, very close up. So you could see what they're thinking. Because he didn't have to say. Gandalf was worried about Frodo and the ring. Instead, it's his close up. Is it secret? Is it safe? Right? You don't have to say, Frodo, I'm worried about where you put the ring. Is it in a good hiding spot? Right? Like, you don't have to say that. So the 3 quotes that I had that I really liked. Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? I understand he's trying to communicate some sort of deeper point here, perhaps. But there has to be better ways of trying to say what he's going to say rather than ship floats don't sink. The next one is, why Elrond? You really have become a politician. I've not read all Tolkien's work. I would bet a good amount of money the word politician doesn't come up in any of his books because he was really, really good with language. He was a linguist. He had better ways to say things than, oh, you're a politician. It's just very bland and could be said in a million better ways. And then I forget what the context of the scene was, but she was talking about how she shouldn't be going home to Valinor. She should stay here and look for Sauron, because if she goes back to the Valinor, like, she's still going to have to deal with, you know, all the stuff that happened to her while she was here. She was talking about like the scars, her memories or something like that, or the evil that she's seen. And she said, it's not gone from in here. She puts her hand on her chest like that. It's not gone from in here. You don't have to say that to see that she's troubled by what she's seen and that she's perturbed. You can show it. That's the benefit of using film or TV, having this visual medium, is you have so much more of an opportunity to show, not tell, because you can see the characters. You can see what they're thinking. You don't have to say, Gimli felt upset. You can show he's upset.
It's this clunky sort of fill-in narrative dialogue. And specifically for me, it was, I don't remember exactly the line. I'm going to paraphrase this. But it was something like, we've been at this for years. We've been wandering the wastes. We've been doing this. It's been so many years. No one's seen Sauron in this many years. We don't know where the castle... It's just this like clearly filler narrative dialogue to get everyone caught up on what exactly is happening, as if we can't put it together ourselves. It's obvious what's going on. They're up in the northern wastes where no one is, clearly. They're miserable. Again, you show it. It's seen in there. It's not like we don't see it. You don't need this line. You do not need this line. It is absolutely unnecessary. It's clunky and it sounds terrible. And it's this choice that makes me wonder who was making the decisions on the final cuts of these things. Were they so concerned that the audience wasn't going to pick up on what was happening at this point, even after they've already given a catch up on the narrative with Morgoth and Sauron, which, by the way, I was disappointed with, that we're just going to brush over that. We're going to brush over the fact that the trees were put out.
Yeah, I thought they would have done more with that.
In the Silmarillion, that event was so pivotal to what occurred with the elves and what occurred with the Ainur. It was so pivotal. To just, and maybe this is my own preference, that just to brush over that history is to lessen the impact of what is going on. Morgoth was the one.
Wasn't that one of like the biggest events in history?
Yeah, it is the biggest event probably in the history of Middle-earth, Arda, as far as what occurred on the shores of Valinor. That was in Valinor that happened, right? That the trees were put out. There were none like that anymore. That was the point of that. And you get the tree in the Tree of Gondor is from that. They inherit that that's a seed from those trees, the trees of light, which is, again, closely tied to Galadriel. I'm not going to go into it, but it's very important that you understand the relationship between the elves and these beings and the Ainur and the, what are the lesser ones? Maiar. Yeah, the Valar and the Maiar. The Maiar being the lesser spirits, Sauron being one of them. They're like the servants of the Valar. So, which is why Morgoth is over Sauron, because Morgoth is a Valar. He's an Ainur. One of the things that frustrates me is they just brush over that event so quickly. That was the traumatizing event. That would have been the most traumatizing event. Why then? And I understand what they're trying to go for. She's seeking vengeance for Sauron killing her brother Finrod. I understand that. And they're trying to establish it as the setup for it is, look how close they were. When she was a child, she was picked on and bullied. I want to say this. It is not clear to me that elven children were going to be exactly like human children in temperament. So this is, again, one of my...
I would imagine they're very different because they're maybe not even just a different race, but like a different species. Like they're not human. And in the books, Sam's always like, oh, we're going to go see the elves because they're these magical beings. And even men who have regular interactions with the elves are still like in awe when they go visit Lothlorien and are in the presence of these magical people.
Well, the people that have seen events that men can only hear about in legends. It's always interesting to me. You watch Lord of the Rings and you're like, Elrond was around for all of these events and then more. And don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting the elves are these angelic perfect beings. That's kind of how they're portrayed. Tolkien did want to communicate that, though, the way he describes them. They're these fair, bright, almost bright creatures. And a lot of shows and movies and video games and stuff take notes from that. So I'm thinking of Skyrim specifically.
Yeah, me too.
The Elder Scrolls, you have the High Elves, who are very much taken from Tolkien's lore.
Yeah, they're very tall, very fair.
Tall, fair-skinned. Yeah, it's very, like that Nordic influence, which is important to the narrative and the story to communicate that they are this way because they are sort of these angelic beings. They're not like men who can be any number of different, complexions and types of things, but men have their own elements of mystery to them as well because in the books, it's not actually understood how they came to be. They just were there one day.
And also something important, I feel, in the prologue of The Lord of the Rings called Concerning Hobbits, I believe it is. Tolkien's talking about hobbits, kind of what they are, how they came to be, and their history. It's not the most riveting reading, but it's important. He mentions that the hobbits are most closely related to people, real people in real life, not the men in Middle-earth. We're not even like closely related or share any sort of similarities with them. It's the hobbits that we have the most in common with and that we would most relate to, not the men.
I would think culturally. The humans in Tolkien's world, though, philosophically, they're meant to be us. They're a representation of our highest aspirations and, of course, our lowest. Because you have human nature, as discussed constantly throughout, which is the failures of humans to be disciplined and to make the right choice. That's the story behind Aragorn and his fight with the ring and with Sauron and his lineage. And it's a great narrative within another narrative, by the way, which is the history of Aragorn's family and how it ties to the elves and history of the elves and the Men of the North and the Númenóreans and all these elements. It's really cool. Again, Silmarillion goes into this, but the importance of this is what I'm saying is watching the characters portrayed and the setups and the payoffs that they're making. Clearly, they've taken some liberties with the characters, specifically Galadriel, who is the main protagonist of the show. They've taken some liberties with her character because there are elements that you don't see. And could there have been warrior-like aspirations or elements to Galadriel? It's not beyond the pale. That's not my suggestion. It's happened in Lord of the Rings. Tolkien's actually famous for putting it in a book. If anyone remembers, the one who killed the Witch King of Angmar, based on the prophecy. Yes, that was a woman fighting. It was done in a great narrative way. That was a character who killed him. It wasn't a caricature of a person, right? That's another important part. Same thing with hobbits. More than likely, most hobbits would not have been great warriors, but they were clever. That's one of the things that makes them, that's one of their strengths. Bilbo's a great example. He's clever. He wins his fights with his mind and his wits. So it's important for characters, to have these elements. But one of the issues I have with the liberties that they take with Galadriel is it feels as if she's lacking in character now.
She seems very one-dimensional.
Right. All the work that would have been done to set up her character, like for the downsides that she has, it's not there. Like her biggest downside is she cares too much kind of thing. This is another element of where it's frustrating to watch because it's like she's stubborn, but she's the only one who's right. Like they didn't make it seem like she did something bad by leading those elves to their deaths in this obsessive search for Sauron, because she doesn't learn any lesson from it, right? She hops off the ship right before she gets to Valinor, which we'll get to later, but like her lesson from it is like, well, I was always right. I should have just listened to myself. Like I shouldn't have bothered listening to these people. They're just selfish. And it's like, well, let's have let's have some dimensions to this. Like these aren't just selfish people. Like
seems like a very childish way to view the world. Also, like it seems like something that I've witnessed myself with my youngest sister when she was like 5, stubborn, and she's convinced she was right all the time. Sometimes she would be right, not often though.
Right, and it's sort of seen where it's like, well, Elrond's a politician, as you said before. Like they have this line where he's a politician. He clearly doesn't care about her, and he's subverting her
expectations.
No, get that out of here. No, he's using subversive techniques to get around having to deal with telling her directly like, hey, we want you out of here. You're trouble. So he tricks her into getting onto the ship to Valinor, and that makes him eligible for this new political position with the High King. And it's like, why are we treating the elves like they're this like petty political organization at this point? Like the High King is something of relative importance. And this is an important thing to me. Elves are not the same as like modern day men in politics. Let's please cut that. Even the men in Lord of the Rings are not like the modern day men in terms of politics. There are some of them, and they're treated that way. Specifically, Isildur is one of them in the original Lord of the Rings. But he has elements of honor to him as well. I don't like what they necessarily did with him in Lord of the Rings, but they didn't have much time to develop him. He's just this sort of one-dimensional character in a way. I understand why that happened. But if you have a whole show centered around a character, this should not happen. Elrond, being the way he is a setup for his character development and growth, right? He's deceitful and lying, and I'm sorry, but that is such a departure from Elrond. Like, if anything, Elrond was headstrong in the books, in the Silmarillion specifically. He was headstrong, and like his relatives before him, he shared in mixed blood. Elrond's not a pure elf. It is an important element, to the story. Also, another weird element, though, is that the relationship between Elrond and Galadriel, to me, seems a bit odd.
It is a little weird. Because it seems like from how it was portrayed in Lord of the Rings, and I'm thinking about the movies specifically. I can't pull anything from the books at the moment, but it seems like they were very respectful of one another because they're both ring bearers. They're both extremely powerful beings, and they're both thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. They've been there almost since the beginning. And you get more from their relationship in like the 2 seconds of screen time that they share in the Lord of the Rings movies versus this show where they have multiple scenes together. They have long conversations bordering on almost like a romantic interest.
I didn't get that feeling. I didn't. It didn't appear to me that there was any romantic interest, like even hinted at.
Not when they're standing there in the garden holding hands.
It's because they didn't portray it as that. Like he says that they're friends, and the main divisive issue isn't like there's not some subtle hints that he wants to be in a relationship for obvious reasons they can't do that because Elrond actually married Galadriel's daughter. But I think there are elements of their relationship that are fine in a way if Tolkien made a world where elves were younger and didn't grow and grew and evolved later into different people who are older and wiser, and it's like, well, yeah, they do, and they learn things clearly, but as long as those two have been around, it makes it appear as if, for example here, that Galadriel's like in her 20s.
It's like this coming of age story almost.
Yeah, which you can't do with this character. I think this was a poor choice, and I know many people are going to criticize it. Like, well, let's just pretend it's a make believe world. It's like, well, that's not a good argument against what I'm suggesting because of what Tolkien established. This is what I mean by staying true to the source material and working within this box that he's created.
Mm-hmm.
You have room, right? You could have made a story, interesting one about Galadriel and how she felt about the Silmaril. Or not the Silmaril, sorry, about the trees in Valinor being snuffed out and that being a traumatic event, and then her brother being killed by Sauron and all these elements. You could have made a really cool story about how she comes to be the character we find in Lord of the Rings, right? The Lady of Light, the one who bears the star, their most precious star, right? Who represents the old elven culture before everything had happened, before the split, before the Civil War, before the divisions between the Noldor and, these different kingdoms. How did this come to be? You could explore that. And like how she's dealing with it, because she's one of the originals. Like Elrond isn't, right? She is. She's one of the one of the first lines. And she's a great character. And it feels like she's being cheapened, I suppose. And I know it's early on, but it feels as if she's being what she's been molded and created to be, is this one-dimensional character who doesn't struggle in areas where it would be interesting to see her struggle in. She's not a natural warrior, according to Tolkien's writings. She's not a natural warrior, according to Tolkien's writings, but he gives much of his devotion to showing her character as this faithful, she's faithful to her people. She understands her role. And she's a leader of her people. She has to be. But she also understands the nature of leadership is not always going out there and being in front of everyone all the time. And it's what makes her very wise and a compelling character in the books. She sometimes is. She sometimes is this character who's a little more, outgoing isn't the word, but it's she gets involved. The problem with making her into this warrior princess thing is they have to make this narrative where now her character is driven by revenge. It changes the whole complexion of what her character is. You know what I mean? This is something.
Yeah, it's not Galadriel anymore. It's just generic elf lady number one.
Right, or even just like Galadriel, but transformed into a different character entirely. Like she shares more in similarity with her brothers now than she does with herself, because her brothers were these headstrong, warrior types, whereas she was not. She had learned a different trait. And much of the Silmarillion is dedicated to showing the elves learning from the Ainur and having their own trades that they learn. And she specifically is one of those who learns a specific trade. Celebrimbor is another one. And they discuss it in the first episode, and I'm curious to see where they go with this. It's a really cool idea. They all learn trades from these great, you have Aule, the great the Master Smith, right? I think that's the one. But all the Ainur have their strengths, right? They have these cool strengths that they have these abilities, and you have the sort of Zeus of the Ainur.
Mm-hmm.
You have the Hades of the Ainur. You have all these cool characters, right?
The Ares, the Athena, the
Right. And clearly it was drawn from Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Christianity. Just all elements were just gathered together. It's such a cool world that you could explore, and you have these cool characters who learn from them, and you could make stories about it. And this is where they win. She's a generic warrior. That is so boring of a choice, and I understand why they did it. This is my opinion on why they did it. I think that they knew to some degree that people wanted to see action in a Lord of the Rings show, and I understand that. I would rather see a show that's filled with action, battles, great moments in battles, because that's what you get with the original Lord of the Rings. But what I think they missed is that one of the most important aspects of that is in the midst of all those battles, you have Gandalf, who is delivering these beautiful lines that tell you the story of Middle-earth in a way. You have Aragorn, who's living out the history of his people and struggling to come to terms with the fact that his family in the history of Middle-earth has not done well. And he can make it right, or he can run from it. And for most of the time, he's been running from it. He's got to come to terms with that. You have Frodo, who's living in the shadow of Bilbo, and who's bearing this burden. Even though he knows it's the right thing to do, he's back and forth. He would much rather not be there. And he expresses it all the time. But he's learning how to be an actual, what it takes to be the person that he has to be in this story. You have Sam, who's learning what it means to keep a promise and to maintain service and loyalty. This is what makes Lord of the Rings so compelling, isn't just the world building and the history. It's that Tolkien did all that and created really compelling characters that can be portrayed very well. Galadriel could have been portrayed so well. Her struggle with her people's history, being one of the original people that, were involved in this whole split of the elves and the fall of Valinor and the trees being snuffed out, that is such a compelling idea. The trauma that would have been involved for them. To see their gods essentially brought low, right? It was a dark time, literally and figuratively. And to brush over it and to make the story about revenge against Sauron, because we all know who Sauron is. Nobody knows who Morgoth is, who hasn't read the Silmarillion. But we know who Sauron is. It's like, that to me is lazy and frustrating.
Is that your first note on your notes?
Yeah, with the dialogue. It's
Okay.
that, and then what they made Galadriel. So those are my first two notes, is seeing Galadriel and the character that they set up with Finrod, that she learns the lesson with the stone, and the reflection on the water, which, by the way, is in my opinion, such a dumb setup and payoff for a lesson that you can learn. Is I don't know which way to go, and it's
sometimes you have to go the way to go in order to know which way to go.
That's what I mean. It's there's no clear direction. That it's just just follow your heart is the same way. You might as well just said that. Just follow your heart. You'll know
what you do what you feel is
which
best.
is not always right. That's the frustrating part. It's not always right. The lesson is completely opposite, I think, of what Frodo had to learn in Fellowship.
He had to do everything he didn't want to do.
Right. He had to learn to not follow his heart. Hey, I never would have been here. I wish Bilbo wouldn't have pitied him. And it's all this great line. It's just there are powers at work that are not you. You are not the center of this universe. You need to take a back seat and understand you have a responsibility here. Right? This is what I'm afraid of in the modern age of, ultra feminism that goes way too far. We're going to get a character who is so one-dimensional. She can't be wrong. She can't lose a battle. She can't fail at anything. Her biggest failure must be that she's just the only one who's right and no one else sees it. And she kind of gives in a little bit, but then learns that, her greatest power is her always right instinct. And that's what's frustrating to me is we'll get into this as we keep going to this episode, but this is what it feels like is being set up. And if I'm right, I have some predictions I'm going to make about some of the next few episodes and where I think they're going to go with this character, but we'll keep going for now.
The next note on my list is that a lot of the male elves, the majority, with the exception of like Gilgalad, have short hair. And I don't understand where that comes from. It's stated time and time again throughout the books that the elves have long, beautiful hair. They do not have short hair. It's intrinsic to them, like their pointy ears. They have long hair. They use it for stringing their bows. That's part of what makes their bows so good, is because they have their hair is the string. And obviously there's magic in the bows as well. They all have long hair. And I don't understand, like, they've definitely taken a lot of creative liberties with this show. This is such a strange one to make. Like, it's so bizarre to just give the elves short, like, 50s style, like, haircuts. I don't know where that's coming from. I don't understand the purpose of it. It doesn't make any sense to me. And in my opinion, it's just stupid.
Well, specifically with Elrond, you know, he's one of the more prominent elves. Like, you would at least make him.
Yeah, because at least you have like a reference for what he kind of looks like.
You know what part of me thinks it might be?
What?
They introduced a black elf.
Oh, and he couldn't have long hair.
He can't have long hair. Yeah, I'm wondering if that might be the decision based on that, which is like,
Yeah, maybe that's the reason why. I don't know. But they could have given him, I don't know, at least braids or something. And that's another thing is people are complaining that there's a black elf. It doesn't bother me that much. I don't really care. Should he be black? You could debate that. Race swapping doesn't bother me that much as long as it's not the focal point.
you can get away with it
If it's done well.
if the writing is good. Writing will
Yeah, like-
cover all nature of issues that you might have with visual elements or lack of commitment to a source material. That's one of the reasons Faramir, most people are fine with Faramir being changed, is the writing surrounding him and his character development is good for that character. Is it my personal
Yeah,
preference?
it was still good.
No, but that's just my preference. It's good writing still.
Yeah.
It's fine.
Yeah, I don't have a preference for elves being white or black.
Like glowing angelic beings. Like they're not even white. They're like glowing.
They're like luminescent.
Yeah, like you'd have to find like the white. So I understand you can't accomplish that.
Yeah.
We don't have glowing people.
Yeah, and white's the closest you can get because
Honestly, the actress though who played Galadriel was probably the closest you're gonna get. She was as white as you can possibly get.
yeah, I don't care that there's a black elf. Race swapping is fine as long as the writing's done really well. Like Gordon in the Batman, the one that came out this year. I think he's traditionally white, right? Like in the comics and in all the other movies.
Usually, it doesn't matter though. Yeah, that is one of the least important matters. It's his character that matters.
I saw a lot of people complaining that Gordon was black. And I thought that was my favorite Gordon that I've seen. I thought he was really good. I liked him a lot.
He's no, he's the best. That
Yeah, he
actor
was
did
so
the
good.
best
I
job,
loved
I think,
him.
as far as the portrayal of the character, and the writing was excellent though for the whole movie. The writing was great. So like, yeah, I think for most things you can race swap. Like that's one of the characters you could easily just race swap any way you want. You can make a Mexican for all I care. But that's what I'm saying. It's like I don't care what the character's race is. If they do well, as far as the writing goes, it will be fine. All right. The elves is a different story a little bit. I just think that's a tough one because of the element that's like involved in it. Men is fine. Like you can have men that are race swapped and kind of moved around, and because it's never really stated what they are there specifically, and so it doesn't matter as much. But I think for the elves being a kind of species that they are, having, I don't want to say homogenous skin tone would be better, but it might, in my opinion, might be better as far as the narrative goes. But it's like you said, it's not essential. Like it doesn't make or break the whole thing. Like having a black elf.
Elves aren't elves because they're white.
Same thing with the dwarves. There's nothing wrong with having a black dwarf. I don't care about that. The dwarves are even less written about by Tolkien, but the issue is always going to be the character.
Yeah. Another thing I was going to say, kind of going off of the short hair thing, is Elrond. The way I've seen people make this argument because obviously I don't know the actor's name that plays him, but he looks vastly different from Hugo Weaving, I believe. He looks so different, and people are saying like, "Oh, obviously this is fine because it's a young Elrond."
Old young Elrond.
That's not that's not how the elves work. They're thousands and thousands of years old, and they are described countless times in the books as looking neither young nor old, looking ageless, looking like you can't tell how old they are when you look at them. They especially don't look like they'd be 1,000 or 2,000 or 4,000 years old. So the idea that you would have a younger looking Elrond makes no sense. You could have maybe less developed Elrond, like he hasn't been through, maybe as much as he has been when we see him in The Lord of the Rings.
Well, he definitely hasn't been. He hasn't been through the original fight with Sauron and the struggle in Middle-earth and the difficult times that came after that.
Yeah, so you could say that he's less experienced, maybe, but his physical appearance would remain the same because elves are immortal. Well, they might age. I'm not sure if some of them were born as children and grew up, and then once they...
Well, I can hear the arguments now that Elrond isn't pure. He's not a pure-blood elf. I can hear it, coming up right now. Which maybe you can make that case. But this is one of those ones where I don't have as much of a problem with it if writing was good around his character.
But it's not.
I don't want to make this the focal point, like the way he looks, because that's such a... My issue with it isn't, like, I can get past something like that, is what I'm saying. I can totally get past that. And I know the people that are going to defend the show are going to go like, well, that's such a nitpick, and like, it's very hard to do, and I can see all their arguments, and some of them are very valid arguments against that idea. Is like, yeah, you could try to find somebody who's looks a lot more like that, but then what are you doing with the quality of the actor? Are you sacrificing that for the lookalike element, and how many aspects are you going to sacrifice until you get there? But I suppose one of the problems I have with it is that in this show specifically is that my note on Elrond here is that they turn him into a politician, right? It's even stated explicitly, like we discussed earlier. Like, he's a politician. I would love to know where they get this idea of Elrond. Like, there are obviously political elements to the elves. There always have been. Elrond being in the mix of all of them makes sense. But he's not a politician, fundamentally. He's just the leader of the elves. Or he becomes one. He's a great individual character. And exploring his character would have been great to see as well. But the setup again for this character development is, well, his downside is he's willing to do whatever it takes to get into a higher position of authority. And it's like, no. That's not a good place to start with Elrond. Again, the source material gives you plenty of areas to go, and this is my own personal critique of the source material, or the faithfulness to the source material here, is that if you want to make a compelling story about Elrond, focus on the aspects of his family that he has to deal with, and how the elves, see him. You could do that. That would be great. You know what I mean? But going this direction feels like it centers again around Galadriel, where his betrayal of Galadriel is going to be the focal point of his character development, right? Whereas Galadriel's is, I wonder how they're going to deal with it. I am curious to see what the fallout from his decision making is, and how they're turning Celebrimbor into a pretty bad guy, right? Too, like he almost seems like a villain the way they introduced him.
Everyone's a bad guy that doesn't agree with Galadriel.
Yeah, so in The High King, it seems like a villain. And don't get me wrong. Well, don't get me wrong. The elves were not always great people, especially the specific group of elves that, caused the Civil War and divided everyone up in that way. Like, there were some atrocious things that were done in Valinor to portray the elves as this caricature of human politics, where it's like, oh, well, I've got a speech, and you see him, Elrond, I think is the implication that Elrond wrote the speech for the High King that he gives to Galadriel, and they're like beating around the bush that she shouldn't have been out there, but he's going to do her a favor and not humiliate her or whatever. Such a dumb idea. Mm-hmm. It turns the elves, in my opinion, into this like joke where it's like, And don't get me wrong, there are elements of it in The Hobbit where the dwarves and the elves have issues and it's kind of petty and childish. But it goes back a little ways, like the way they view dwarves and how the dwarves
And they
were
have a long history of disliking each other.
right. And there are stories that back this up. Same thing with humans and elves. Like humans and elves have had their disagreements and had their issues, but elves have had their issues with other elves. Like there's a history there. So many elements to explore, yet they don't go out on any of those roads. They just turn this High King into sort of a like empty-headed politician where it's like, that's not, I'm sorry, but at the highest levels, that is not what is going on. Not everyone is empty-headed except Galadriel. Like, I'm sorry, but they're not that stupid. They're aware of the threat that Morgoth poses. They were witnesses to it. And when he was put away, they also understood the threat that some of the Maiar spirits that followed after him, including Sauron, represented. They understood the threat of the Balrogs. They understood the threat of the dragons. They understood the threat that was always at their doorstep. And they were the primary defenders of Middle-earth as a result. I can't remember a time where they were just like, oh, well, we'll pretend like evil doesn't exist. Or is it still around? Or is the threat gone? Surely it's not coming back. Now, men did that and were constantly deceived. To be honest, even the elves were. But it's not like this political environment that they've created in the show. I hate that so much, that's what they've turned it into. That Elrond's over here reciting this speech for the king.
It feels more like modern
Yeah.
politics rather than something that would have happened. Tolkien's fantasy is based heavily, but not entirely, on medieval fantasy. Or not medieval fantasy, the medieval period. With the weapons and the armor and how you have a king and the subjects.
Even the behavior of the characters too is culturally, very like this old English, like Anglo-Saxon.
There's an honor system, and it's better to die in battle than to die of old age.
Anglo-Saxon kind of inspiration behind it. The tales of King Arthur, Knights of the Round Table kind of thing. Elements certainly involved in the story. Watching the politics of the elves and Celebrimbor and Gil-galad and Elrond.
The politics and the Phantom Menace were better.
Well, yeah, they weren't. They were very heavily focused on, but they weren't caricature of modern politics, or they were, but I guess they weren't a caricature. They were a great example of like politics that had occurred in like the 40s and examples of what happens when a dictator is beginning to take control and how politics can go downhill very quickly for people that don't have ideals that they stick to or principles, right? Often this is the case with politics, but what is the thing that the elves lack in ideals? You know what I mean? Like, that's the problem, is like what we just talked about. Its honor is not lacking in the elves. They're just misguided often. They think they're the greatest thing, and that they're a specific group of elves, or the elves in general, are just better than everyone else, and that they need to always stay faithful to that idea, and they need to remain pure and separated from the other elves who betrayed them, and that there is another thing. There are family lines that are cursed in Tolkien's world for behaviors that their ancestors, participated in.
Mm-hmm.
That would be another great thing to explore, because there are characters in here that are involved in those stories. I see no indication they're even going to touch on that, which is crazy to me, because it's pivotal. It's absolutely pivotal. That was one of my notes, is the politics that they introduced at that part is very frustrating.
It was very out of place. Very suspension of disbelief.
I skipped one of my critiques was back when they discovered the castle.
Oh, I haven't even gotten to that part in mine yet.
The clunky dialogue. Well, we skipped it because we're at the politics part, which happens after that.
Oh, yeah. Well, in my notes, I'm still back at like the opening scene.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to go through some of your other ones, but one of my notes on that is it frustrated me. The CGI was frustrating. I didn't think it was very good for the budget.
Yeah, that's the next one on my note, is like if you have $1 billion budget and you're not hiring big actors, so much of that, like 99% of that, is going to go into the CGI, and it doesn't look like $1 billion.
Did you feel like the troll and the original Lord of the Rings looked better than the snow troll? Or do you think that was just an element of...
I like the character design of the snow troll. Did it look better? No. The choreography certainly wasn't good in that scene. But hold on, I have a few notes before we get to the castle. Um, the world building that's done in the intro sequence, and pretty much for like the whole first half of the episode, really, is just done entirely through narration. There's nothing. You don't spend time with characters to learn about them and to learn about the environment that they're in. It's just on December 23rd, in the first age, this happened. And then in February 2nd of the second age, this happened. It's just all, here's what's happening in the world. This is what the traumatic event was. This is my brother died, and now this is what I'm doing. In Peter Jackson's trilogy, people say that The Fellowship is very boring because it sets up the world building, it introduces you to all the characters, and there's so much you can learn in the first hour, or even the first half an hour of the movie. You're introduced to the daily life of the hobbits. You see the houses they live in. You see their little farms. You see the kids. You see what they're wearing. You see that they all have curly hair. You see that they have these big hairy feet and they don't need shoes. You see their way of life. You see what they enjoy, what they don't enjoy. And you see all this stuff. And it's not like, this is a hobbit. Hobbits like farming and drinking and smoking. And you get to see that and you get to experience
You
it.
get to see their temperament as well, like their general temperament.
They're very, very easygoing. They don't like fancy, shiny, uptight. They're not like that. They don't like strangers. They're very content in keeping to themselves and keeping the peace. They're very simple. Not to say they're simple-minded, but they have simple interests, and
Country
yeah,
folk.
they're happy with the finer things in life, like good food, good beer, or I'm not sure if it's called beer, but good ale, I think is
Ale,
what it's
Eden
called.
ale.
Yeah.
They have a good time. They're great at parties.
Yeah, their parties last for days, and they make enough food for every single hobbit to eat multiple meals. Like you learn so much in.
And you don't get a narration from Bilbo. Well, you do a little bit, but it's
Kind
more
of, but
you
not
get a you
really.
get a narration from Bilbo, but it's from the book. It's there. You had
Yeah.
to keep it in. It's the concerning hobbits.
That was the brilliant thing that Peter Jackson did. That's one of my favorite things about the Lord of the Rings trilogy is there's so many lines of dialogue that are straight from the book, not even paraphrased, just out of the book and into the movies. And that's because Tolkien was a linguist. He was really good with words. The dialogue in the book was brilliant. The way the books were written were brilliant. And to take the exact dialogue that was in the books and to bring that into the movies was good. So firstly, you didn't have to deal with clunky dialogue because Tolkien already said it really, really well. And it doesn't need to be improved on. It doesn't need to be changed at all. You just have it flow naturally in your script, right? I've not read the Silmarillion. Maybe there's something that the showrunners have put like pieces of dialogue here and there, but they don't have the rights to it. So I don't think that that's something that they could do. And
The Silmarillion is less dialogue, more of a history. It is not very.
yeah, but maybe not dialogue, but lines or explanations or details on things.
No, I don't know that I can think of too many stories where there's a character dialogue. It's not told in that way. It's more of like a legitimate, like just a history where you see events happening. And I think you do have like recordings of like a dialogue between characters. Like, I'm not going to tell you some of them because I think they would give spoilers away about the story. But the story of Beren and Luthien, which is the original Aragorn and Arwen, is probably the closest thing you get to a controlled narrative within it.
Yeah, well, I don't mean like actual lines of dialogue, but I'm just saying like just full lines from the book were put into the Peter Jackson trilogy. And so,
They could draw inspiration from it.
yeah, but they're not
That's
going
the
to.
thing. Well, that's what I'm saying is like they had the potential to look at like how these characters spoke. Do you remember that one YouTuber we were watching? This is a great example that I thought of just now about the language of the writing. Is his critique of Lord of the Rings when he was just going over why it was bad, and he was like, "Oh, you called him a villain,"
Yes.
and it was like, "Well, I've never heard someone say that." I was like, "Yeah, that's an old English.
Yeah, that's how they
A
spoke
villain was
back then.
meant what it meant. He's a bad guy. Is essentially saying thing like, you're just a bad guy. You're
Yeah.
an awful person. It's like people say that all the time in different ways now, but back then that would have been people use that word in their vocabulary. It was a common way to express that idea. We've just moved away from it because of cultural shifts.
Yeah, because
But-
English, or not English, but language changes over time.
Yeah, the cultural use of language changes. Let used to mean something entirely different in Old English. I mean, literally the opposite. It meant the opposite thing that we use it for now. We mean it to allow. It used to mean to disallow.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great example of that. But yeah, so the way language is involved in the stories and how characters speak, it's like what you were mentioning earlier with a politician. So you as a politician, it's like, well, that's not how somebody in Old English would have said it. So you could have drawn a little more inspiration from the way that Tolkien's world was built based upon this Old Anglo-Saxon, like Old English style of speaking, which is a very specific way.
It's a beautiful way of speaking also.
Nobody speaks like that now, which is kind of what brings you, it makes it, what is it, immersive. You're in the world of Middle Earth when you watch Peter Jackson's trilogy because he stays faithful to the Old English style of speaking. You're in this world. Everyone speaks that way. That's the culture of the world they're in. And this one, people speak like they do nowadays. That it does break immersion a little bit. That's probably another good form of critique. I didn't write that in my notes, but
yeah, especially in fantasy where it's definitely not supposed to be anything like the real world. It's a fictional world with fictional people with fictional events. You don't want it to mirror or imitate things going on in the real world because it's breaking your suspension of disbelief to a degree.
I want to be careful with the way you worded that. I know what you're communicating, but I don't think mirror imitate is the way to describe that because often Tolkien does mirror imitate a lot of things in the world as they happen. Like he draws from his experiences in World War One, you know, from the trauma of these characters as they experience it, which imitates sort of the way people experience trauma in the books and how they react to it, right? But I think what you're communicating is rather not mirror or imitate. It's you don't want to blatantly pull like a line that you would have heard in World War One to communicate that. You wouldn't say like you wouldn't have a line in a fantasy book. Like if I wrote a fantasy book about a war, I wouldn't have a line where it's like there are no atheists in foxholes. And if I had a character who was, trying to communicate his faith or something, I would not have that line in there because it's drawn from a language that isn't used in this world that I drew inspiration from. You know what I mean? Like what do they know? Foxholes kind of thing. Like that's not how they refer to them, in these battles or something like that. Or say I did base it. Like say I made a fantasy world where it's set in more modern times, right? Those can exist. We've seen some of those recently and they do have a different speech pattern. Like it's actually more like the way that we speak. And if suddenly you introduced an Old English style into it, and one of the characters, like if you made a movie about it, I'm thinking of one book in particular and I can't remember the title of it, but the characters do speak in a more modern tone where they don't use like that Old English style. But if you you made a movie about that series and in the movie you were like, just one of the characters, all the characters started speaking Old English style, that would be the reverse issue that we're drawing here. It's like the inspiration from the original source material is important because it creates the element of that world that you're in. Like it gives you that immersive feeling like I'm in Middle Earth. Like I'm watching events occur in Middle Earth right now. And which is important for any visual medium, but very important for something like this that's as detailed in world building as they have. They have all this material to draw from. I'd hope they'd use it.
Another one of my notes is the costume design for this show. I watched a really good YouTube video about this. I forget his name. I want to say it's like Living Acronism, maybe is his channel name, but he's a really big Lord of the Rings fan, and he made this video on costume design. And he was specifically comparing like Aragorn's costume, his Strider outfit particularly, in comparison to, I think it was just generic characters from the Rings of Power trailers. He was, and this isn't something that I've thought about, but since he's pointed it out, now I notice it more frequently. He was saying that things that your costume should do is, first off, be functional for the character. It should make sense for the environment that they're in, the job that they're doing, how much wealth they may or may not have. And it should also tell you a little bit about them. So you have Boromir's costume. He's got chainmail armor on, but on top of that, he's got this red and gold tunic, I think it is. It's very beautiful, looks expensive. He comes from wealth, but he's also a warrior. Makes sense for him to have the armor because he traveled all the way from Gondor to Rivendell. It's going to be a very dangerous trip. So he's probably not wearing his best things. And he's got the Horn of Gondor on him. He's a man of importance, someone very important to the people of Gondor, not just a captain in the army, but something more. Something that I noticed like first with the costume design, and it kind of got worse as it went, was when they were up in the northern parts looking for the castle, and they were all just wearing chainmail and like a little like scarf. That was all that they had brought for their expedition into the frozen wastelands. And I guess an argument could be made, since the elves are magical and they weave magic into everything that they do. Perhaps these were very thick and cozy armor sets, and they were very warm and would protect them against harsh weather conditions. Maybe you can make that argument, but I don't think that's readily apparent, as in the books, when they come across elves, they always have blankets and furs and warm things. So I think that you could expect a little bit more from that. And then another thing with the costume design is the armor that they're wearing in the ceremony and then on the ship when they go back to Valinor. I don't see why he would be wearing it in those specific situations, you know what I mean? At a place where you're getting recognized. The modern military does this. The armor that people wear in Afghanistan with the body plates and the tactical camo colors, you don't wear that to where you receive your medals. You have your dress blues for that, or your Aragorn didn't wear his armor when he was getting crowned king of Gondor. He wore a ceremonial outfit and clothes that were fitting for his new title and his new position. He wasn't wearing the dark green and black Strider rags that he was wearing for the Fellowship. And you see Aragorn specifically, you see his outfits change over the course of those 3 movies. You first see him in the black and the dark green, just very dirty, kind of nasty ranger clothes that he wore. In the Two Towers, he's changed into something different. He's got a red shirt. It's very loose fitting, and he's got some armor over top of that to protect him a little more, since he's fighting in battles now, not just out scouring the wilds. And then in Return of the King, obviously you have him in very expensive, very nice armor when they go march on the Black Gate. And then, like I said before, you have him with his coronation. He's wearing very kingly robes, best of the best. So you see the outfits change and grow with his character. We might get that with Galadriel, as we're only an episode in, but so far the outfits don't make a whole lot of sense. And wearing the armor, the big, bulky metal armor, not even chainmail, armor that would be probably better for hand-to-hand combat, is worn to their coronation ceremony and then was worn on the ship to the Valinor and then subsequently taken off as soon as they got to Valinor, was interesting.
I think the metal armor that they wore is ceremonial, though. Like their ornate metal armor they wear. I don't think that they have the same separations as humans do, because everything they make is ornate and beautiful, because they're master smiths, most of them. They've learned from the best. I think you can make a case that maybe they have those, and maybe there's an element of that. Obviously men make their own armor that's very practical, but their best armor is usually made by elven smiths. Like they'll talk about it like, oh, these are made by elven smiths, and this sword was crafted by a great elven smith. And when they find the weapons, right, in The Hobbit, those are elven weapons. Gandalf's sword.
Glamdring.
Yeah, it's elven made. Bilbo's the sword, or the dagger he finds, which is a sword for hobbits. That's elven. Right, Sting is elven. So it has magic weaved into it like we talked about before, so it glows blue when orcs are near. I think they're master smiths, and they make the best stuff, and all of it is very ornate and just beautiful, even for the functional things that they use. So I think you can make a case that they would wear probably similar to the same. Probably a different set, obviously, not one covered in blood and marks and stuff. I don't necessarily have a problem with them wearing ornate armor or anything like that, bulky armor to sort of kind of what would be ceremonial sending off. What I do have a question about is, and I don't remember this from the book, so I'm thinking out loud here. The return to Valinor. That is a major thing in The Lord of the Rings, right? It isn't apparent that they are allowed to return to Valinor. That they have to get the permission of the Ainur, because those are the individuals that dwell there. And
it seems like a very select group of people get to go, and it's not for the elves to control necessarily.
I don't know how much I want to go into because you haven't read it, but there's a reason why they're not in Valinor anymore. and I've mentioned it a few times, but there's a very good reason why they're not there. And there's a very good reason why Galadriel's not there too. She's not on a quest for vengeance. That's not part of her character. In fact, most of the characters that are out for vengeance in those stories are some of her contemporaries, but specifically the ones involved in the fight against Sauron and Morgoth are involved in those like sworn enemies kind of deal. But she's not one of those, as far as I remember. And I could be wrong. But if I go back and read it, I doubt that I'm going to find anything different than what I recall in this case. Yeah, that was another issue I had, was that Return to Valinor was... that felt out of nowhere. That felt like it just came out of nowhere. Like the king... Like, it felt like they introduced it just for her to have that moment that she get. Like, it felt like they wrote that in for the setup that they had made with the stone and ship.
Yeah, they needed to have their emotional payoff, but they didn't actually have a way for it to occur naturally, so they had to...
Right. It was a manufactured scenario, but it was one that doesn't make sense for the narrative. That's the problem. Why would you manufacture one? You could manufacture anything to make that make sense. You know what I mean? But the high stakes they built up was like, she's going to Valinor, she can't come back. There's no coming back from this. And it's like, yeah, but where is this coming from? Like, on whose authority? And I guess most people probably haven't read the Silmarillion or are familiar with what Valinor actually is. At least as Tolkien portrays it. So it is odd to me to see the way that they make it this like portal that they come to at the end of the sea, when in reality I think it's just another land. Just a beautiful, right? It's just a beautiful land that's sort of separated. It becomes separated by I don't want to say a magical like wall kind of thing, but eventually there is a point at which like the passage is not safely granted. And I think it's like a fog or something. Like it's like a thick fog that they can't see through.
Which was, they did show that in the show, when she decides to jump off the ship and not go to the Valinor. The fog rolls in.
But it was just this giant portal.
Could the CGI have been better? Yeah, absolutely. But it wasn't a portal. It just looked like the place they were going to got brighter and brighter from the light of whatever. And then she decided to not cross the threshold to go on to the shores of that. And then the fog started rolling in.
It looked to me, though, like it was just a portal they were about to sail through that maybe you could look through and see it. But it was glowing, like very, like heavily glowing. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. The way I remember it, it looked like a giant opening just randomly. And then, I don't know. Also, a note to that. Wouldn't somebody have said something like when she just leaps off? Like, is there no like concern? Like,
no one was like, "Oh shit, Galadriel!"
Thousands and thousands and thousands of miles. Like, this is not like these are continents we're talking about, where they're like, it took them a year to travel to Mordor, and obviously they had to go around all these different things, and they had all these obstacles. But like, a year time to get through all this stuff, and if they had just walked in a straight line, maybe it takes them like a month or something. As opposed to like what the actual journey was. Well, they could have, because like you think about it, it's like from there to there. This is that distance pales in comparison to the amount she would have had to swim to get back. Pales in comparison. Not to mention, Tolkien never mentions like what's in the seas.
Things that are unnamed, just they're terrible things dwelling there.
Right, you're living in a fantasy world where there are dragons involved, and there are things that go into the deep parts of the earth. And there are elements. Yeah, there are constantly elements involved where like the evil that Morgoth weaved into the world could be manifested in anything. And I'm thinking sea monsters would probably be potentially one of them. You have to worry about all that stuff as you're this little elf woman swimming all the way back, not in your environment. Like
she's not even. She's in like a thin like white dress. There's no way the ocean's warm. Not warm enough for her to.
Well, not only that, that would get super heavy and exhausting.
Probably, yeah.
To swim in. Like, it would soak up all that moisture, it looked like, and it's just tough to swim in. Which, of course, she could just take it off, I guess, and swim all the way back. But, like, can you imagine the elements on the individual body on that case? Aside from the fact that the pure exhaustion, they're not superhuman. They are not superhuman. They experience fatigue, exhaustion. They're immortal. They won't die if...
From natural causes, yeah.
Well, they will from... I'm pretty sure they'll die from not eating and stuff like that.
Okay, they won't die from old age.
They'll die from... Right. Yeah, they just don't die from aging. But I'm pretty sure it might take longer. I don't know the history or the way that he developed how they might die, but I'm imagining malnutrition and fatigue and in heavy exhaustion and serious, like severe situations like that.
They don't need to eat as frequently or sleep as frequently as humans, but that doesn't mean that they don't need it at all. And it's not a necessity for them.
Right. Maybe that's the case. I don't even know if that's true if they don't need to eat it as frequently. I don't.
It's demonstrated in the books with Legolas. It's not specifically stated, but there were parts in, I think, in the Two Towers where he doesn't sleep for way longer than Aragorn and Gimli are able to. He stays watch while they sleep, while they're in pursuit of Merry and Pippin. Not that he doesn't need to, but he can certainly go a lot longer than a normal person.
Right. Yeah, but we're talking about something insane. Like they are, like if it would have been like
oh no, there's no way she's swimming the ocean to get back.
If she would have decided even halfway, that is an immense distance to travel clearly on the map. Like on the map.
And even if there aren't sea creatures, like big like monsters or, what have you down there, I'm sure there are like sharks or some sort of carnivorous ocean animal.
And she doesn't have anything.
She's got her little dagger.
Right, but she can't eat the dagger.
She can, but only once.
I guess she could maybe kill a fish and eat. You could say like she could kill a fish and eat it or something, but like.
Well, then you risk like, the fish isn't cooked, and now you might have to deal with the repercussions of eating a raw fish.
Yeah, it's insane choice that they made. They're not even going to address the fact that she had to swim all that way. That would seem like it would be years of swimming.
It would have to be.
And also, could you imagine like trying to maintain your directional out in the open sea?
If you could navigate by the stars.
From exhaustion then? Like, you know what I mean? Like you have to navigate by the stars consistently, and during the day you have to, like, what are you using? You're using the sun? Like,
I wonder if they'll have the eagles save her. Or if they just won't mention it, and by the time we get to the second episode, she'll just be like back on land, like doing her normal thing. And so we're not going to talk about that at all.
Yeah, like I saw the one thing where I was like, oh, it was Paul Tassie's article that he wrote, and then somebody made a comment. It's like, just because it's perfectly consistent that she, just because Tolkien didn't say she's actually Michael Phelps. And I was like, it was funny, and I understand it now, but like even Michael Phelps, he would just die. He would die. Yeah, there's no way he survives that swim. Like the exhaustion of swimming that many miles. Like, plus that journey on the ship would take months itself.
Also, this is probably a nitpick. It's a weird little ship. It's just like a big ass rowboat to take people for however long the journey is, weeks at the very least, a year or more. Return of the King, the ship that they got on in the Grey Havens to sail to the Valinor. It's a big ship, lots of room. You have like storerooms down below for all the provisions that you would need. This ship, the one that the elves were on, looked like it just had one deck, maybe one singular sail, and you could only fit, how many people was it on top? Like maybe 8 to 12 people standing in a line.
You can make the argument though that the elves don't need as much. Like you could say like, oh, they had guests on this one. They needed to feed Bilbo and Frodo, and so it wasn't like they could just.
Sure, but the ship had double the amount of people, even if they're eating less than what a hobbit would eat or what Gandalf might eat.
Right, but you could say like, if lembas bread has been established as being something that could maintain your appetite and you could just eat little pieces of it, you would literally need like a bag per person.
It's probably a nitpick. It looks so silly.
Yeah, I think it could have been. Yeah, there could have been a better decision there, where there might not have been their choice. They probably could have made a better decision about that. I will agree with that, but I think that is a bit of a nitpick. But it is certainly strange. But her jumping off the ship at the very last minute there, just for their emotional payoff, and then not addressing the fact that she has to swim that distance is remarkable. That is a remarkable decision, and I think that is so awful.
So the next thing that I've noted on here is when they're in the castle and they get attacked by the snow troll. So I'm curious, if that place has been abandoned for so long, what is that thing like surviving off of? What's it eating to make? Because it's huge. It's going to need to have like a really big diet, right? He's going to need to consume a lot of calories.
Yeah, in most of the books, like a lot of the trolls lived off of like wildlife they would capture,
or orcs that roam through. But there's nothing up here. It's a wasteland, desolate.
Yeah, it would seem like it would seem odd to see life up there, but maybe you could make the argument that there's probably like some kind of species of animal. Like you have, like, I mean, in our real world we have our Arctic animals that exist up in the Arctic that are pretty. Polar bears live up there, and they sustain a pretty big diet.
Yeah, because there's the ocean right there, and you have seals and fishes.
Well, you would have the
and-
ocean there too. They're up in the northern waste, and they're right near where the ocean would, especially the fortress.
Maybe it's not shown. I'm just curious what he eats. I'm sure he has to eat something to sustain himself. But
I have less of an issue with them not showing his diet as much as
it's just a nitpick. I'm just curious. Because he doesn't look malnourished. He looks healthy, I guess. But the problem I had, the choreography between Galadriel and the troll it was really, really bad. it was not good. And then when the troll was like 1v6ing the elves should have won, right? Like, they're experienced fighters. They've had thousands of years to practice. They're very good. And that's not just demonstrated by Legolas, but the other elves within the Lord of the Rings, like when they're in Lost Lorien, all of the elves there, very good warriors. Like I said, because they've had thousands of years to practice.
Well, this is one of my notes specifically at this part is that, this thing's fighting all of them and doing some damage, which is fine. It's a troll. It's more powerful than most things. It would be frightening to fight.
Mm-hmm.
But of all the beings to take on trolls, elves would be the ones. They've taken on the Ainur. There were elves that fought Morgoth 1v1. You know what I mean? And did some damage.
Yeah.
They were no joke. The elves were no joke as far as like being warriors. They were obviously some of the best. And, watching them struggle with this snow troll, I understand they have to do it for the, you have to have some action or element of action.
I'm fine with them being like taken by surprise and having a few of them like thrown around a little bit. But after that, it should have easily been over.
It was once Galadriel, she dispatched it with ease, which again, this is probably the case where most people are going to come after me if I say it, but it felt like their Mary Sue moment, whereas like she is the only one not struggling. She's the leader. She's everything she does is just the best. You know what I mean? Like it feels like this is the direction they're heading with it, and they could turn it around. And hopefully, I'm wrong. Hopefully, there's some character development here, but it's feeling like it's going to be lacking. It's feeling as if she's always going to be right. She's always just got to follow her heart, and wherever that leads her is going to be the right place. How do you feel about the Mark of Sauron? What's your opinion on that? That's not something that appears in the book, as far as I remember.
I'm indifferent to it, I suppose. In Lord of the Rings, the Mark of Sauron that the orcs had on their shields and their armor was a red eye. It wasn't this handprint or weird like trident-shaped thing.
Looked like an M.
Yeah, it looked a little bit strange. I'm not opposed to him having a mark. Maybe the eye is some imagery that he picked up after he was quote-unquote killed by Isildur. After the ring was taken for him, maybe his artistic style developed. He got some trademarks. But didn't really bother me. It just seems like, I'm not sure if a MacGuffin is the right term, but it just seems a little bit too obvious, a little bit like, it just seems weird. I agree with Elrond when he says that, just because you found this mark in the castle doesn't mean you're any closer to Sauron. Like, just because you've seen it doesn't mean he's near or you're getting closer or you're learning more about it. You've just discovered this. For all you know, all of his anvils could have these marks on it. You don't know anything. And it's supposed to be like, oh, well, obviously she found it, so she's getting closer. I'm like, but you don't know that. You don't.
Yeah, as far as the narrative goes, yeah.
You know why a ship can float and a rock cannot?
Yeah, but she's following her heart, and her heart's never wrong. That's another thing of the narrative element is like she can always have this like go-to where it's like, Finrod told me what's the difference between a ship and a rock, and now I know. Well, I presume it's mass and weight and density, and well, it turned into this metaphor that went in a different direction than I thought I was going to go, and then the idea of
No. It's because I don't even remember what the reason was. It was something about light and darkness, I think.
she's not knowing which direction to go. It's reflected the same way in the sky. It's like, this is definitely me nitpicking this part, but it's like, oh, well, if you already know the distinction between the light reflection and the actual light itself, you have your answer. If you can already make that distinction, if you're like, well, sometimes the light is clearly reflected as it is in the sky as it is in the water, and it's like, I get what they're going for, but at the same time, when you say that, it's a point of reference where you're like, my point of reference is your orientation. You're on the ground, water's on the ground. The sky is up. Easy. You have an answer. Now, maybe if you're like knocked out and hanging upside down by your feet, but pretty soon you're going to figure out you're hanging upside down.
Maybe they don't know which way is up.
Well, the really dumb thing about it is just like artificial setup for an artificial payoff, which all are fair enough in any fictional narrative. Well, they fit within the world better. They fit not just within the world. I don't mean that in that sense of like it has to fit in the world building. It does, but this one doesn't violate that. It just is dumb. It's just a dumb metaphor. It's a dumb one. They could have come up with a better one. You're not going to convince me otherwise. They could have had better writing right there.
It just feels very cheap. With $1 billion, you could have paid for a really, really good metaphor.
Yeah, I could buy a better metaphor for $5, I think.
Yeah.
But the narrative there is it's starting to feel very forced. Like Galadriel's in the Northern Waste looking for this, and she's obsessive. That's what they communicate, right? They communicate it both in the dialogue and in the characters. They show and they tell, just to make sure you don't miss it.
This could be a nitpick, maybe, but every time, I hate to keep like saying this, Peter Jackson did a really good job in the original trilogy with differentiating between destinations. The Shire had a very, very specific look. It had rolling fields, small farms, small creeks, obviously the hobbit holes with the round doors built into the hills. The villages were small, walkable distances for, little people. Places that were built by the elves had a very distinct feel. Lothlorien looked beautiful, magical. Rivendell looked beautiful, magical. Gondor looked different. You could tell that they had a history with architecture, the way things looked, and they took great care in building things. And Rohan had its own look. It was fields and farms because they were horse lords. They need space to breed their horses, for them to roam, for them to train or whatever.
And each culture had their own architectural designs that were different.
Yeah, they had their own architectural designs. They had their own, not costumes, but they had their own dress. The people of Gondor, they were very proud. They wore lots of more neutral colors. The people of Rohan, also proud, maybe a little bit less wealthy it seemed, but they still wore reds and golds and greens, and they had really long blonde hair. Whereas the people of Gondor they had darker hair, and I think gray eyes is at least described in the books. I'm not sure for the movies, but Peter Jackson did a really, really good job with that. Like if you took a screenshot, any point in the movie, you know where you are because he did such a good job with transitioning. This is what Moria looks like. This is what the swamp looks like that Frodo has to travel through. This is the difference between even Bree and the Shire looked very different. The Weathertop looked different than, just some random field out in the middle of Rohan. With the Rings of Power, there's no real differentiation between where they are. When we're getting introduced into a new destination in this show, the camera pans out and a map appears, and then the camera moves to a different part of the map. The map transitions into this, CGI or this live shot of somewhere of, the grass and the trees. And then up in the little corner is a subtitle that says exactly where you are. Peter Jackson didn't need to do that because he could communicate, obviously, where they were based on the differences in nature between them, the differences in architecture, the differences in styles, the differences in people, in tones. When they first go to Edoras, it's very depressing, very dull. They have nothing. Their king doesn't care about them. He doesn't care about the troubles of the world. He's just locked away in his room. And you don't get that with the Rings of Power. So right now we're in Valinor, and the map moves, and then, right now we're in the southern part of Middle Earth. And there's a subtitle that pops up once we arrive there to tell you exactly where you are, because we cannot show you.
Well, they do. It's by definition a visual medium. It's just they don't execute it very well. It's like they were rushed. It's like they felt rushed. And they were like, we need to make sure everyone knows that this is where we're at and this is what we're doing. Because Peter Jackson does use the map in Lord of the Rings. He uses that map overlay where you like go back over it, but there's no like telling you exactly where you're at. He uses it sparingly, and the only times...
Yeah, this time in the first The hour that we watched, they used it, what, 4 or 5 times?
Yeah, something like that. Every location that you move to is,
Yeah. You see the map, and then you have a little subtitle pop up.
except for Valinor. I don't recall them doing it with Valinor when they were there with the trees, because that's like the opening narration.
Yeah, but it had you go from Valinor to...
Right, but they didn't. There's no one, like, it doesn't pop up and say Valinor. You know what I mean? Like, which I think is actually one of the more, that's probably the one place where you could have used it, because like it's a little confusing to most people, I think, where Finrod comes over that hill and you see the city and you have then the trees, the lights of the trees go out, and that one scene where it's like the traumatic event that occurs, where it's like a lot of these things are a little, like at the beginning is probably where you could have used that, like the setting. If you were ever going to use it, that would be the place. After that, you can do the little map thing maybe once, maybe twice more if you're going a certain distance, or if it's a key element of the narrative. Like when Peter Jackson uses it in Return of the King, it's to show how far they've come. Like it pans over the map that Tolkien had made, and it shows like, oh look, there's Moria, oh look, there's Fangorn Forest, oh look, there's Bree, oh look, there's the Shire, and it stops in the Shire, and it's like, oh look, we're back in a familiar place. And it's like, yeah, it's to show how far they've come and all the different locations they've been, and you've shared this adventure with them, and it feels right when he uses it there, because you're not going to show the whole journey back. So yeah, I think you're right. I think location set pieces in the original trilogy are great, well done, utilized the show don't tell method every time. You get the feeling of the place, the elven architecture and the beauty of Rivendell. It's captured alone in the excitement that Sam has had, like, for seeing the elves and their cities and how beautiful it is, and then the fleeting feeling of it too at the turn of the age where they're at is, oh, we've seen it, but Sam wants to go back. That's the Hobbit character coming through. He's seen it, yeah, whereas Bilbo wants more adventure. He's tired of it. Frodo even wants to go back. But Frodo understands something that Sam doesn't, which is there may be no going back, truly. Sam is naive in that sense, but that's the great element of that. What do you get comparable in the show so far? Nothing. Galadriel is a one-dimensional character up to this point. I know people will argue and say, well, she's got character flaws. Clearly, she's overly, aggressive in her pursuits. She doesn't care about people, but they don't portray that as bad. They portray that as a good thing. They're all wrong. She's brave. They're cowards who don't care about anything. She's the one seeking the evil out, even though she's seeking it for vengeance.
Yeah, because she turns out to be right about everything, and it's like there's no consequence for her behavior.
It doesn't matter because she's still seeking the evil. It's out there. We all know it's out there because it's Sauron, and we know that, spoiler alert, he makes it through the series. But we know he's out there, and we know she's right in a sense that he's out there and that he's not just going to disappear. So it's like the showrunners knew that, and they were just like, well, see, she's right. You can't argue she's wrong. It's like, yeah, but in this scenario, we have to view it from the perspective of these characters and what's her motivation. Like, I feel like Elrond was right, even though he's kind of being deceitful to do it. And so that's how that we know that he's not a good character at this moment. He's not making good decisions. He's very political, and his agenda is not right and pure like Galadriel's. He's right in almost everything he said. Like, the first sign that it's the case that Sauron's still around or that he's going to make trouble, like, hey, I'm on it. Honorable Elrond would have actually done that, not been political about it. That's another issue I have with the way that they're portraying the character, but it's another thing in itself. So I just think the decision-making about the narrative is not good. With the source material they have,
they took a lot of creative liberties with a lot more than I expected them to.
Well, that's the importance of having the rights to the name. Like, that's cash in itself. It's guaranteed viewership. People want to see this world. People love it.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If you want to make your own fantasy show about, an elf warrior princess, fine, go do that. But that's not what Tolkien did. And I think they only used the Lord of the Rings title because if it was just generic fantasy, no one would watch it. But everyone loves Lord of the Rings. That's how you're going to get people to watch it, is because you have someone else's name on your work.
Crazy to me, though, is they're using so many things to shield themselves from criticism. The fact that they have multicultural actors and actresses, it's diversity. And it's like, that's not enough. You can't just have that. That doesn't get you out of having to write a good story, especially with the source material you're working with. Like, sorry, but you've put yourself in a difficult spot.
Tolkien left way too detailed of a history for you to just be like, oh, well, we don't know that this didn't happen. Like, Tolkien may not have explicitly stated this, but it doesn't need to be explicitly stated when the characters have been developed.
Yeah, well, the characters most obviously, it's one of the more developed characters. Like, I'm sorry, but Galadriel is not one of the minor characters necessarily in the Silmarillion. Not I wouldn't say it's like the major characters. Like there are a few major characters in that book that are like really explicitly gone over, but you can't tell me that we don't have good source material for them to draw from with this character.
Switching gears from the elves a little bit, the Harfoots, I have several issues with. The big thing I've seen from the directors, because people are saying that hobbits weren't a thing in the Second Age, they didn't exist yet, and the directors were saying to that, well, the Harfoots are not hobbits; they're the Hobbit's predecessor, right? Not a hobbit, related though. But the Harfoots as a people, Tolkien explicitly said in the prologue to The Lord of the Rings, it says the Harfoots are hobbits. Explicitly is what they are. They've taken something and changed it from what it was into something different just to try and be historically accurate. I'm not sure. At this point, just say they're hobbits and leave it at that.
Just say you wanted hobbits in your story because people recognize hobbits from Lord of the Rings. And it's like, no, just leave them out. You don't need that. This is still the world that we're, experiencing. You have elves and men and orcs.
It doesn't matter to have them in it or not. They are nomadic farmers, which is such a bizarre choice. Have them be, nomads. That's fine. They can. I don't think that's what a hobbit would do. They have been demonstrated to find a place that they like, settle down, plant their roots, start families, grow farms, drink, smoke, avoid people.
Avoid conflict in other groups of people.
They like to keep to themselves. So the nomadic thing is a little bit weird. I would have just made them farmers and just had them settle down because that's what they do. Also, and this could be a nitpick maybe, is the Harfoots are like, they're dirty. Like they're covered in dirt. They're covered in, when they were out picking berries, they're covered in like the juice and they're very dirty. In the books, the hobbits are always like, when they're traveling, they're excited to get a bath. They're excited to sleep in a clean bed. They're excited to eat. They aren't just living there. They're not like kids where kids just kind of live their lives. And if they get dirty, oh, well, it's not the end of the world. The hobbits enjoy being clean. In the books, whenever they get to a new destination, they get to take a bath. They're so excited because they get to clean up. Tolkien devotes so much time with them arriving to new destinations and spending, whether it's a sentence or a paragraph, on them either washing up before dinner or taking a bath or how they take a bath, like how specifically you would need to heat the water up and prep the baths and all that. He didn't just say, oh, they arrived to their destination and had dinner. He was very explicit that the hobbits were not slobs. The Harfoots are just, I don't know, they're just so dirty. Like their faces are just like covered in dirt.
And I'm fine with the idea that they've not yet, if you want to introduce this element, although I would argue it's not necessary, if you're going to introduce this element, fine, make them nomads who gather, as they travel and they know the area and they can hunt, I guess, but farmers doesn't make sense. That's kind of something you need to stop and take time to do. You don't farming doesn't take a little while. Like it's very strong commitment. You need good land, you need good soil, you need good sunlight, you need good rain production, you need
to care for them. You need to weed your fields. You need to make sure that the critters aren't getting in there and eating everything. You can't just plant something, walk away, and come back like a year or two later and harvest it.
Some things you can, but most things you cannot do that with. Not anything that's going to actually give you enough to sustain that lifestyle, as far as like you have that many people involved with children and you're growing. One aspect of it I do want to talk about is, what is the deal? Did you catch what the deal is with this older guy who seems like a shaman or something?
The man with the book, the crazy man? I don't know, because that's the thing is I understand that they're not technically supposed to be hobbits in the show. Fine. But if they're the hobbit predecessors, then they should exhibit some traits. They should share some similarities with the hobbits that we see in Lord of the Rings and in The
Which
Hobbit.
they do a little bit, because they're a bit, the elements of them, they're like a bunch of Merry and Pippins running around. The kids are anyways. They're just getting in trouble, doing whatever they want to do. That's a very Merry and Pippin thing.
Yeah, sure, the kids. But it's the adults don't act like the adult hobbits do in the books. And the old man, I'm not sure what the purpose of his book is, if it's supposed to be like some sort of like prophecy thing, because he was pointing at the picture of the moose man, and then in another scene he was pointing at pictures of the stars. And I'm not sure.
He seems like a shaman or something, like a wise man in their group. Like he's
Maybe I think he's like the village like crazy person, but he's gonna turn out to be
maybe.
right. Like he's gonna be the one that sends the girl on like an adventure, not purposely, but he's gonna say something and she's gonna go off on an adventure instead of staying at home because the world's scary. And it's just that trope of someone yearning for something bigger, and everyone's just like, no, don't do that.
Well, I'm fine with that trope because it's as old as humanity. You know what I mean? Like it's what drove Luke Skywalker to want to get off of Tatooine, right? He's seeking adventure. He wants something bigger than what he's looking for, but he has to learn difficult lessons on the way. Do I think that this individual character that they've introduced, who is, by the way, happens to be a female, do I think she's going to learn much? Or has she already figured it all out and everyone else has to learn from her? There are elements of that in Luke Skywalker where people learn lessons from him about hope and going where they need to go. But Luke had to learn a lot of difficult lessons from his travels, that he wasn't right about all this stuff. And it's like what we talked about with Frodo earlier. Frodo had to learn a lot about it from his travels. He had to learn a lot about himself. Sam had to learn a lot about himself. Is this character going to learn about herself? Or is she going to do most of the teaching like Galadriel seems to be doing so far? Or they're going to have to be right about everything before everyone else finally gets, with the picture and figures it out. That's what I'm concerned with, is that this little hobbit is going to be teaching many, many people many, many lessons, which is fine, but put some character in there. Make her a little fallible. Frodo gets obsessed with the ring, and you can see his struggle with it. He's a little too over the top about his commitment to it, and he's not honest with himself about how far he's gone. And he starts to get selfish. Sam, jealous. He doesn't like Gollum. He doesn't see in Smeagol what Frodo does. He's too far, suspicious. But it serves its purpose, right? Eventually he turns out to be right about it, but he kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? He hurts Smeagol and it doesn't help the relationship. So there are flaws to these characters that have to learn these things and that are, these hobbits that we've seen before. I'm concerned. We'll put it that way. By the way, this sequence that starts after they come back from the castle and they're back with the elves, and you start this whole scene with Elrond and Galadriel is so boring.
The whole show is just abysmally boring. Like nothing's exciting or interesting.
Well, it just drags. Everything drags. They introduce, with the hobbits, they introduced this wolf, or the Harfoots, sorry. With the Harfoots, they introduced that wolf. And it's gonna come up.
The wolf that looks like it's got like some genetic like birth defects.
They introduce it and it's like, oh, are we going somewhere with this episode? No, it's coming down the road. It's like, okay, is this gonna be a major factor here? Yeah, the absolute bore fest that is that sequence where it could be a great place to develop the characters and they kind of involve themselves in that, right? So this dialogue between Galadriel and Elrond is pivotal because you're supposed to see their relationship as it is. They're great friends. And then we find out that Elrond's not quite on the up and up. He's very political, as Galadriel happily pointed out without knowing much of the situation that they were in, because she's just very good at everything she does and always pure. And everyone else around her is kind of oblivious or evil or both. This development of the characters is fascinating to me, that's the direction they're taking it. Like Elrond's going to have to figure this out. I imagine he's going to find out that Galadriel's always been right and that he's been wrong and that he needs to stop it. That's very obviously where the character is heading. He's not going to be political anymore after this. And he's going to denounce that part of the elven culture that's developed, I guess. I'm not happy with that direction, I will say. I don't like the characters being developed in that way. That's not faithful to the source material at all. It's a leap to me to make the elves that political and to make Elrond that involved in it, especially Celebrimbor.
This is definitely a nitpick, but it's just something I was noticing as there were a lot of walking sequences. is where are all the horses? Why is nobody riding horses anywhere? Everyone's just walking slowly from destination to
Well,
destination.
maybe they didn't include that in the budget.
They didn't budget for horses.
Oh, what did we use all that money for? Remember that snow troll scene?
The perfectly choreographed snow troll scene.
And making Galadriel, her face appear during that climbing scene.
Howard Shore did an amazing job with the Peter Jackson trilogy. The soundtrack and the music that was playing during different scenes also helped to establish where you were in Middle Earth. The Hobbits have their own iconic song, not song, but soundtrack. Rohan had a very distinctive sounding soundtrack. Gondor had a very distinctive sounding soundtrack. And then obviously for all the battles, you had very distinctive elements in there as well. And the soundtrack was subpar at best. It just felt like someone put on like, you know, on YouTube, they have those 10-hour long videos of things. It's just different pieces of music. It just sounds like someone put on like 10 hours of somber violin music in most of them. And then in the scene where the kid's under the floorboards of the stable or the barn and he pulls out the handle of the sword, I'm supposing
That's what that was?
Yeah.
I thought that was just like a dagger. A weirdly shaped dagger.
No, it was the handle of the sword and it had the cross guards on it and the blade was broken off like the Morgul blade.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just completely missed that then. I
Yeah.
did not know what that was. I was trying to figure it out. I was like, is that a tiny little weirdly shaped dagger?
No, it was the hilt of the sword where the blade had broken off. It sounded, I don't know if you remember the music that was playing during that scene, but it sounded like very stereotypical horror music, like straight up from The Conjuring.
Like heavy strings, like off.
Yeah, like just like they went to like one of those like royalty free websites, typed in horror music, and that was what came up.
I'll be honest with you, I don't recall any of the music, which is crazy because like you said with Lord of the Rings, it's iconic. Like when you say the music of Rohan, I can in my head I hear it playing. Yeah.
Yeah, you know exactly what it sounds like. The Hobbits, you know exactly what it sounds like.
Like it's like Rohan, it's like that. Like there's this like very clear beat. The Hobbits, you know exactly. I know exactly what you're talking about when you're in Hobbiton. Like if I hear that music, that's the imagery that's going to come into my head. Like it's very well done, very well done. Very few productions have that level of quality as far as like soundtracks go. So
yeah,
I don't want to hold it too high of a standard, but this is just.
They spent $1 billion on it. They could have done way
better. And they
put
the name on it, so they have to live under the shadow of that trilogy. So it's like, yeah, I just don't recall any of the music from it. It's just forgettable. It didn't stick out to me at all. If I rewatch it, maybe I can pay attention, but I legitimately don't recall.
The thing with the Peter Jackson trilogy is anytime there was a new scene or you went somewhere new where there were new characters, it was a different song that was playing. In this, it was just like the same, like it just felt like the same violin throughout all of the scenes. And sure, maybe it crescendoed a little bit when there was something exciting happening or they were in a fight or there was an action sequence or something scary was happening. But that was about it. There was no iconic, oh, this is the Hobbit soundtrack. I know this. I recognize this. There was no, this is when they're marching on the Black Gate. It was very iconic. I know what this sounds like. There was none of that. It was just bland, I think would be the best word. It was just very bland.
Generic fantasy music.
Yeah. This whole show is just generic fantasy. Like they're in Tolkien's universe writing their own story, but they have no idea how to do that. So they just end up stealing from him, but they don't even do that well.
Reminds me of the quote everyone always quotes. Tolkien is saying like evil can't create something in and of itself. It can only corrupt that which is already good and has been made well or something. Paraphrasing obviously, but it's the generic. The quote is meant to communicate something about substantive metaphysical evil, but they all use it for the narrative team, which I think is very humorous.
Yeah, it is. What is the Black Elf's name? Arendir. I felt like the intimidation part of his character felt very, very forced. they did a good job with Aragorn when he was Strider, right? Just sat in the back of the room, didn't pay attention to anyone, or no one paid any attention to him. He just sat out and observed what was going on, and it was kind of making Frodo feel uneasy because he's just sitting there menacingly, like he's not he's not doing anything. He's not like Arondir was, where he's just up in your face, just with a deadpan expression, just staring for every scene that he's in, like over the top intense.
I didn't mind that. I actually like that. He's one of the few elements that I actually enjoyed because that whole part is just made up. Like none of it is involved in Silmarillion. None of it. I felt like the writers had a little bit of probably freedom from certain elements that were in the show, I'm guessing. And so they could kind of write this character and whatever it was as they wanted. For example, I'll counter that with, I don't think everyone intimidates the same way. I don't think elves are going to do the same thing as like Aragorn in that situation, because he has a reputation he's developed over time, and he's been living out kind of in the wild on his own for a while. And so he's developed his reputation over a period of time, and people know of him as like one of those, what does the hotel owner say? He says, he calls him, he's one of them rangers. He says they're dangerous folk because they go out and live in the wild and you don't know what's out there kind of thing. That's the element that makes him, that adds an intimidation factor to him, is like he's mysterious. You don't know much about him. This character is out on patrol, so I don't think you can make his character the same way. Like he can't just be sitting in this bar, in the corner of the bar. He comes in with his full set of armor, that's ornate. I actually did like their armor design. It could have been better.
It was interesting. It didn't.
It had that like soldier out on patrol, not the best armor they had, but not the worst. Like it still was like elvish armor. Like I don't have a problem with it. I think it was fine. You could have done anything you wanted because there's no specific.
It was my favorite armor in the show for sure. But when you compare it to the Peter Jackson trilogy, it's not as good.
It's a different environment. I will say this to defend that part of the show where like the elves are returning from their posts now, so you're out there with this elf and he's got a conflict of interest because he's falling in love with this woman, but the humans there don't like the elves and the elves don't like the humans, but the elves are there to just kind of keep an eye on them. And there's these different elements. It's got a lot of potential. That by itself has a lot of potential for a good show. If you strip the show of everything that involves Galadriel and Sauron and all the other stuff that we recognize, I would take a show just about this area that they've completely made up.
Yeah, because then they can't ruin anything that Tolkien did.
Well, that's part of it. But you also have potential here for a good story. You know what I mean? You have a potential for a good story about a character that is, I think he's interesting. I think he has some dumb dialogue, but that's not the actor's fault.
Yeah, it could be interesting. I've seen some things online that suggest that it might not stay
I have
interesting.
no hope for a lot of the things that go on, like where they start off with good potential. I guess I've been burned too many times at this point, but I don't think the criticism of this aspect of it is the same as the rest of the show, because the rest of the show involves characters that are forced. You know what I mean? Like this character can be forced. It could become the case, but so far from what I've seen, there are interesting elements they're bringing in from different directions. You know what I mean? The son of this woman is fascinated with this relic from a time past, and he could be the potential for evil to enter back into this world kind of deal. So it creates a huge conflict with this guy and his love interest and her child, who also doesn't like the elves and is more influenced by this other younger guy, and they're enthusiastic, and there's lots of cool elements they could build up on here to create lots of conflict, potential for character development. This elf has to reconcile this element of essentially a forbidden love, not only because it's a human and elf, interaction, but also because these peoples have a history with each other that aren't good. So you have all these elements that you've introduced that could become good, as far as a narrative goes. But I'll just say I'm not holding my breath for it to turn out well.
I feel like this is going to be the best episode of the show.
What, episode 2?
No, episode 1.
Oh, I hope not, because it was not good.
Yeah, that seems to be the trend of these type of shows. Like, I understand that this wasn't made by Disney, but Moon Knight, first episode was really good. Kenobi, first episode was decent. Mandalorian, first episode was decent. Boba Fett, first episode was all right. And then Like the further you get into the show, you're just like rapidly going downhill.
I think a lot of it has to do with like a lack of risk taking. They start out taking risks. Almost every show you mentioned, they take some risks with some of the material they have. Maybe not Mandalorian because all of that show is kind of new. I think those shows that you mentioned, like Moon Knight, took some risks with that character, making him the way they did. They did a great job showing, not telling. There was no narration telling you what was going on. We figured it out though, because most people can figure these things out. You don't need the narration. You just need these elements introduced, and we'll piece the puzzle together. It's not that difficult. But I think a lot of shows just treat their audience like they're idiots, and maybe for good reason. Maybe that's the target audience at this point.
Just consumers.
Yeah, people that just like, I like this. This is media. I like it. That reminds me of the people that like Last Jedi. They're like, it's just a great standalone movie.
It says Star Wars, so it's good because it says Star Wars. It says Lord of the Rings, so it's good because it says Lord of the Rings.
Oh, look, they made stuff. Action. Wow. Snow Troll. Oh, that's cool. I already like this. Yeah, I think a lot of people like that don't understand what makes the show good anyways. Like, they would just like almost anything. Like, you would have to make it so bad that they wouldn't enjoy it.
The last note I have on here is just Meteor Man. Mr. Tumnus comes crashing down in the meteor.
I have a feeling I know what that is.
What is it?
I think it's one of the wizards.
Is that how they came to Middle Earth?
They sailed together.
Oh, it's going to be one of the blue wizards, isn't it?
I bet you it'll be like a young version.
I don't know anything about the blue wizards.
That would be the direction because they're not expounded on. But they went up to the east. They traveled to the east. They didn't stay in the west. Most people don't know much about them. All that we know is that they did eventually travel to the east. It was to the north and to the east to, I guess, be among the men of the east. So nobody knows what happened to them because Tolkien never really wrote about it. He never discussed it. It was like I think it mentioned in passing that they just disappeared into the east one day. And it was like they never saw him or heard from him again.
I hope it's not a wizard. I hope it's just Mr. Tumnus.
I think it's going to be a wizard. I think they fundamentally misunderstood like the nature, and this goes back to the original source material yet again for the Silmarillion, the nature of the Maiar spirits and what they're meant to be. Most people don't understand it either. They think Gandalf's the original like thing that appears in front of them. In reality, he's wearing a cloak. He's not actually an old man. You know what I mean? Saruman's not actually an old man. Radagast is not actually a dirty old man. Like they all served a different Valar when they were there. And they all learned a different element of a trade from the different Valar. Sauron's the same way. He was a Maiar spirit. And he learned a trade from Aule, I believe, on how to craft things, like smith things, which is where he got his ability to make rings of power. He's a great sorcerer and a great smith. But he learned the sorcery from Morgoth. Yeah, Sauron, the Maiar spirit, is, as far as like levels of individuals and beings, Sauron's on the same level as the Balrogs and Gandalf and Saruman and all of them. They're not Valar. They're not Ainur. They're lesser spirit. They're a little above men and elves. And that's why I think fundamentally misunderstanding the nature of the Maiar, especially the wizards, if this is a wizard, it's really annoying that that's how they introduced this. Because they sailed over and then just started traveling one day. They're not like...
They didn't come crashing down in a ball of fire.
Hopefully it's just a separate character they made. That could be, I guess, interesting or cool or something, I guess, if they did it right. I doubt they will, but...
I would be very pleasantly, but very surprised if they actually did get anything right, according to Tolkien.
Well, they got some aspects right. Like the history of Morgoth, the disappearance of the trees of Valinor.
Sure, but it was never expounded upon. It was just like,
right.
Trees are gone,
I'm just saying, let's be fair to say, like, let's not say that they got nothing right. They've got some narrative elements correct. They just haven't executed them well. They've skipped out on where there might have been really good stuff for a show. They've got the characters and their siblings correct, so far anyways. They've got the roles of some of the characters correct, at least in lip service that they pay. So we where did we stop? We got to the part where, yeah, I was just thinking like chronologically with the last part of it is where she jumps off the ship, which we talked about, the stupidity of it.
No, the last part was the Meteor Man. The ship happened just before that.
Oh yeah, the Meteor Man's the last one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, she jumps off the ship, has to swim that whole way, which is ridiculous, and then the meteor man drops from the sky, which I'm curious to see. My suspicion is it's a wizard. That's my immediate instinct. As soon as I saw it, I was like, this is how they're going to suggest that the wizards came over, even though we know how they came. Well, I guess it implies, I think Tolkien implies that they just sailed over from Valinor, and they have certain roles that they specifically were meant to fulfill. They were given those roles by the Valar, who were given those, they were given dominion over Arda by Eru. There's interesting histories of these individuals that are portrayed in the Silmarillion, which is where you get some of the lines that make sense from Lord of the Rings, which is really cool because you have no context for them in the regular books. So if all you read was Lord of the Rings and you haven't read the Silmarillion, you don't know who Morgoth is, you don't know who the Valar are, and you don't know who Eru is, Gandalf's line that he says to the Balrog won't be as meaningful. When he says, I'm a wielder of the sacred flame, he's referring to the flame of Eru, the flame imperishable, which allows, it's the only thing that allows something to create life, which is why Morgoth can't create, and the Valar can't create life by themselves. They can only give it life, essentially, from the flame. They can craft individuals, but Eru is the one who has to give them life from the flame, imperishable. But yeah, my main concern still remains that the philosophy undergirding all of it, that drives the narrative in the original Lord of the Rings trilogy, and the stories that take place beforehand. I think what's missing from that may be a very important element, and I think it's because it goes contrary to what a lot of the showrunners and people in charge have in mind. Alrighty, well, I think that concludes this episode. I appreciate you listening, taking the time to hear our thoughts on the show. We hope to continue this and go into more detail on the next few episodes.
I would rather not continue this. This show fucking sucks.
Yeah, I'm not looking forward to putting myself through any more of this, but I'm willing.
It's not even like mildly entertaining.
I'm willing to say like that's the first episode. We've only watched the first episode, but
yeah, but the first episode's supposed to it's supposed to be the hook. It's supposed to get you in and interested to the show, and it's not done that.
Yeah, and so far poorly executed. I will say this, I do want to see the next episode just to see if I'm right.
Yeah.
If it is the wizard. That part got to me. That was such an unusual element to introduce in a Tolkien story because there's nothing comparable that I can think of. A man falling from the sky. Although Tolkien did introduce a lot of mysteries and interesting elements, I don't think it's completely against the spirit of what he wrote, but if it's something that he already introduced and has, placed in Middle-earth,
it's probably going to be one of the blue wizards.
It'll be so dumb if it's a wizard. I will be so upset if that's how they introduce the wizards coming to Middle-earth.
Well, they don't care. Clearly, they don't give two shits.
No, they don't. I don't think they care. They'll take what they can use and put out product and people will consume. But anyways, yep, that's our thoughts on it. Hopefully you'll tune in for the next episode, and we appreciate your
listenership,
if you will.